Oh boy, what does it mean? Boy, I don't even think about that kind of stuff.
There are artists who live loudly, and then there is Alison Krauss. For nearly 4 decades, she has occupied a rare space in American music, beloved, decorated, and almost entirely unknowable as a person. She speaks through her music, through the careful choices she makes about which songs to record, which collaborations to accept, and which parts of her life to shield from the public eye. And for the most part, the world has respected that boundary, filling in the silence with admiration rather than intrusion. But silence, no matter how carefully maintained, eventually develops cracks. And at 54, one of those cracks has finally widened enough for the truth to slip through. After more than 2 decades of quiet, Krauss has begun speaking, not with the dramatic confessions of a celebrity unraveling, but in the measured, deliberate way she has always spoken. Slowly, thoughtfully, and with devastating clarity. The subject is her marriage to fellow musician Pat Bergson. The marriage that began in a rush, lasted 5 years, and ended in 2001 without a single public explanation. 4 years, fans and media outlets speculated. Touring schedules were blamed. The pressures of a demanding career were cited. 2 musicians, 2 sets of obligations, too little time. It was a tidy story, and Krauss never bothered to correct it. Until now. To understand what happened inside that marriage, you first have to understand who Alison Krauss is and where she came from. She was born on July 23, 1971, in Decatur, Illinois, and raised in Champaign in a household that took learning seriously. Her father, Fred Krauss, was a German immigrant who had arrived in the United States as a child, eventually earning a doctorate in psychology and later building a career in real estate. Her mother, Louise, was a working illustrator with roots in both German and Italian heritage. Between the two of them, creativity and discipline were simply the air the family breathed. Music entered Krauss's life early, not as a grand destiny but as a household constant. Her mother played banjo and guitar, which meant folk sounds were always nearby. Alison started classical violin lessons at 5. She wasn't immediately passionate about it. She resisted practice, dragged her feet, and showed more enthusiasm for roller skating than for scales. But she stayed with it. And somewhere between stubbornness and instinct, something remarkable took root. By the time she was 8, she had picked up a bluegrass fiddle, learned Tennessee Waltz by ear from a Richard Green album, and competed in a local talent contest at the Champaign County Fair, placing 4th in the novice category. It wasn't a victory, but it lit a fire. By 13, she had won the Walnut Valley Festival Fiddle Championship and been named the most promising fiddler in the Midwest. By 16, she had signed with Rounder Records and released her debut album. Vanity Fair later used a single word to describe her at that age: virtuoso. The trajectory from there was extraordinary without ever being loud about it. She built Alison Krauss and Union Station into one of the most respected groups in bluegrass history. She became the youngest member ever inducted into the Grand Ole Opry, stepping onto that stage at just 21. Grammy after Grammy followed, eventually totaling 27, a record-setting number that places her among the most decorated recording artists of all time. She contributed to the Oh Brother, Where Art Thou soundtrack, which exploded into a mainstream cultural moment and reignited national interest in roots music. She collaborated with Robert Plant on Raising Sand, an album that stunned critics and defied every genre expectation. Through it all, her voice remained what it had always been: clear, high, almost impossibly still, the kind of sound that makes a room go quiet without demanding it. Against that backdrop, the arrival of Pat Bergson in her life in 1996 felt, at the time, like something that made complete sense. Bergson was a musician himself, a skilled guitarist and harmonica player who had worked with respected artists across multiple genres. He understood the rhythms of touring, the emotional demands of creative work, and the particular kind of isolation that comes with being constantly surrounded by people while remaining deeply alone inside the work. When the two of them connected, it moved fast. Within weeks of meeting, they were married, December 8, 1996. No extended courtship, no elaborate celebration. Just 2 people who recognized something in each other and didn't want to waste time. 2 years later, their son Sam was born in July 1999, and for a brief period, it appeared the family had found its footing. But appearances, as Krauss would later acknowledge, can carry an enormous amount of weight that has nothing to do with reality. By 2001, the marriage was finished. Krauss was granted full custody of Sam, and she folded her attention inward, toward her son, toward her music, and away from any public conversation about what had happened. She offered no explanation. She made no dramatic statements. In a 2002 interview, she touched on the subject so briefly and drilly that it barely registered, comparing the residual awkwardness of separation to an occupational hazard of the Nashville music world, as though the whole thing was a mildly inconvenient professional footnote rather than the end of her family as she had imagined it. That was, for many years, the entirety of what the public knew. Speculation filled the void, as it always does. The most common assumption was professional incompatibility. Two touring musicians whose schedules simply pulled them apart. It was a reasonable theory, even a sympathetic one. And Krauss, by choosing not to correct it, allowed it to stand. What she has shared now, carefully and without melodrama, paints a more complicated picture. The core of what Krauss has described in more recent conversations isn't a single dramatic event or a betrayal easily reduced to a headline. It is something slower and, in many ways, more damaging. An incompatibility that ran beneath the surface of everything, invisible at first, then impossible to ignore. She has spoken about the experience of being inside a relationship where the emotional language simply didn't translate. Where the very qualities that made her who she was, her quietness, her need for solitude, her tendency to process pain inward rather than outward, were not understood, and over time, were not respected. She is a person for whom silence carries meaning, for whom restraint is not coldness but a form of deep integrity. Living alongside someone who either couldn't or wouldn't understand that distinction proved, over the course of 5 years, to be corrosive in ways that were gradual until they suddenly weren't. There were pressures from both sides of the equation. The touring life, the career demands, the weight of sustained public success. None of it makes a marriage easy. But what Krauss has made clear is that the difficulty wasn't only logistical. It was personal. Something fundamental in the way they related to one another stopped working, and once she could see that clearly, she was not someone who would pretend otherwise. She has also been candid about the role that motherhood played in that clarity. The moment Sam was born, her priorities reorganized themselves completely and permanently. Whatever the marriage was or wasn't, Sam was not a casualty she was willing to accept. Stability for her son became the non-negotiable center of every decision she made from that point forward. She pursued full custody not out of bitterness, but out of a fierce, unambiguous conviction that her child deserved a settled, protected life, regardless of what his parents had failed to build together. What makes Krauss's account of this period so striking is not the content of what she reveals, but the composure with which she delivers it. There is no victimhood in her telling. There is no bitterness disguised as reflection, no attempt to reframe herself as a wounded figure in need of public sympathy. She speaks about the end of her marriage the way she speaks about the end of a difficult recording session, with honest assessment, without self-pity, and with complete acceptance of the outcome. That composure, however, came at a cost she would not fully reckon with for years. The same discipline that allowed her to protect her son, maintain her career, and keep her private life out of the tabloids also created a kind of emotional compression that eventually demanded release. She has spoken openly about the voice problems that plagued her in the years following the divorce, a condition diagnosed as dysphonia, which caused her throat to tighten without warning, made singing feel labored and unnatural, and ultimately led to a public moment of failure during a live show in Utah in 2015, when she stepped to the microphone, opened her mouth, and produced nothing. Just silence. In front of an audience. The kind of exposure that cuts straight through every defense a person builds. Her vocal coach eventually identified the problem not as purely physical, but psychological. She was carrying too much weight into the performance space. Years of held-back emotion, years of protecting herself through containment, had built up a kind of internal pressure that her voice could no longer absorb. The block was real, but its roots ran deeper than her throat. She has talked about the unusual technique that helped break the cycle, stepping outside before performances and yelling. Not singing, not warming up in any conventional sense, but genuinely yelling. At trees, at open air, at nothing in particular. Releasing something that had been held too tightly for too long. It sounds almost comical, and she acknowledges that freely, even finding humor in the image of herself standing in a parking lot shouting at shrubbery while her band watched in bewilderment. But it worked. And the fact that it worked tells you something important about where the real blockage had been all along. Now, at 54, Krauss speaks about all of it with a kind of earned perspective that only time can produce. The divorce. The silence that followed. The years of compressed emotion that eventually surfaced as a physical inability to sing. The impersonation scandal in 2013, when a woman spent months convincing a vulnerable elderly man that she was Alison Krauss herself, exploiting the very absence that Krauss's retreat from public life had created, stealing not just money and property but an identity that its rightful owner was barely able to inhabit at the time. Taken individually, each of these chapters is striking on its own terms. Taken together, they form a portrait of a woman who has spent most of her adult life choosing protection over expression, containment over catharsis, and privacy over narrative, and slowly, painfully, learning the limits of that approach. The revelation about her marriage is not that it ended for dramatic reasons. It is that it ended for deeply human ones. That two people who shared a world, a language, and a child could still fail to truly understand each other. That speed, no matter how instinctive it feels at the start, cannot substitute for compatibility. That control, even when it is the right choice in a given moment, has to be balanced eventually against the need to feel, to release, and to be genuinely known by another person. Alison Krauss has never been the kind of artist who explains herself. She has let her music carry what words would only diminish. And in many ways, that is still true. But what she has shared at 54 is not an explanation, it is an acknowledgement. A quiet, unflinching admission that the version of events everyone accepted for 20 years was incomplete. That the real story was more complicated, more painful, and ultimately more instructive than any public narrative could have captured. She didn't divorce Pat Bergson because of schedules. She didn't step back from her voice because of a physical condition. She didn't withdraw from public life because of mystery or aloofness. She did all of it because she is a human being who was carrying more than she let anyone see, navigating a life that demanded everything while offering very little space for vulnerability, and doing it with a grace and discipline that was both her greatest strength and, for a long time, her most quietly destructive habit. At 54, she is still here. Still recording. Still performing. Still choosing her songs with the same deliberate care she has brought to every decision across 4 decades of an extraordinary career. The voice is back. The son is grown. The marriage is long past. And the silence, finally, has something inside it worth hearing.